You ever have one of those nights where the thing that saves you becomes the thing that takes you? I mean, yeah, that sounds dramatic, but if you let me tell you what happened to me, you'll see why I say that. This is the story of the little man who kept me company and the envelope that kept showing up. Good evening, and welcome to Midnight Horror Society. Here we take the strange and the chilling and tell them slowly, like whispers meant for the night. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe only if you feel at home here. In the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always comforting to see how many of us are awake together in the dark. So dim the lights. Let the sound of the night, rain, crickets, or just the quiet of your room settle around you. Get comfortable. And when you're ready, let's step into tonight's story. It was past midnight when I first noticed the envelope on the nightstand. The room smelled like bleach and old coffee and something else. The same metallic, sweet rot that follows a body you've handled all day. I remember that smell because I breathe it in on purpose most days. It's how I keep from thinking about the person I used to come home to. The little man was sitting on the edge of my bed like he belonged there. Small, smaller than a child, but not quite a child, ankles crossed, hands folded. He had that ridiculous, careful posture like someone waiting for a bus. I should have screamed. I did not. Part of me, some well-practiced muscle, went into observational mode. He was there. He was real. And I could tell because the light from my lamp hit the hollow under his cheekbones and made a thin shadow there, the kind only real skin makes. He looked at me the way a neighbor looks when they greet you on the stairs. Calm, curious, not hungry. "Don't worry," he said. His voice was small, like paper folding, but it had warmth in it. "I won't hurt you. I just want to talk. That's the hook, I guess. The moment I let a stranger explain himself in my bedroom, and I listened. I want to tell you I had some better sense, some hardened instinct. But by then, I was a woman who handled dead bodies for a living, and a widow who had spent a year learning to let the world move around the raw place in her chest. Listening felt easier than fighting. People ask me what it's like to work for the medical examiner. They imagine morgues with white tiles and sharp surgical smells and a kind of sterile heroism. It's not that. The morgue is a job. It's logistics and paperwork and temperamental vans with grease in places the manuals don't mention. It's showing up to apartments where the cat has been fed fine for weeks, and the apartment still reeks like it's been simmering in something dead. It's carrying the weight of someone's entire life. Photo frames, dented keys, a favorite mug, wrapped in a shroud or a sheet. Back to a metal tray we call the cart. It's trying not to make a life out of other people's ends. My name is Sara. I don't like introducing myself as Sara from the medical examiner's office, because that sounds like a headline. I liked him, my husband, because he laughed at wrong jokes and burned toast and believed I could fix anything with patience and WD-40. He died 12 months ago. It was sudden. Heart stopped, like a candle snuffed. People say those things happen and you get closure. I have found that closure is a bureaucratic concept. Grief is messy and lodged in places where light doesn't reach. Grief is a ringtone that never stops. I took this job partly because I wanted to be near the end of things, partly because the work made my personal grief feel less personal, oddly manageable. I could treat death like a task and keep the rest of me from falling into it. The first months were okay. I learned the routes through the city like lines on my palm. I learned to breathe around the smells. Bleach for the hands, rosemary for the brain. Some of the paramedics joked about that. But mostly, I learned how to count steps, the lift, the hallway, the stairs, the apartment, so that the faces of those who had died didn't flood my head when I locked the door behind me. Still, some things stuck. The bloated chest of a body left too long in the heat. The sound of maggots when you moved a tarp. The pinned wide eyes of someone who'd been butchered. Those things left prints on me like a cheap stamp. At night, I would come back to our small apartment, the one he and I had picked together before he was gone, and try to feed my brain something else. Eat, shower, light the candle, go to bed. That rhythm kept me afloat for a while. On one of those nights, the power cut out while I was in the shower. I didn't panic. Power cuts are common in certain blocks. I remember the water on my shoulders like a comforting hand. The lamps died and the bathroom surrendered to a soft, wet dark. I fumbled for matches, a childish image, I know, struck one, and the candle flame shivered alive. The room looked older, the way things do in candlelight. More honest, more immediate. I made my bed like some mechanical act, walked through my day in my head, who we had removed, what the coroner had said, and tried to drown everything in the hot water residue of my shower. Sleep was thin then. I would jerk awake in the middle of the night and try to remember if any sound outside meant someone had made it through the day. I started hearing things in the apartment. A creak that wasn't the pipes, a paper rustle that wasn't the fan. The city is always noisy. You learn to sleep through it. But the things that live in your head after you've seen too much death, they don't let you sleep the same way. That's when I first noticed movement at my doorway. I can't explain the physics of such fear. A body that has become familiar with gore can still become a coward about small things. I flicked the light back on and saw nothing. I sipped the tea I'd forgotten to make and told myself I was tired. But then, one night, when I was halfway to bed and the candle made my pillow a small island, I felt the air change. The scent in the room shifted from laundry soft to the sharp, clinical tang of hospital corridors. A silhouette was there. Little, hunched, a hand on the jamb like it wanted permission. I watched him materialize. The little man's head was faceless in profile until he turned. I will never forget his face, the way it carried too many childhood features for someone that small. A rounded chin, a forehead that hinted he'd thought seriously at some point, eyes like two pinpricks softened by kindness. He could have looked absurd, like a puppet, but he didn't. He looked like someone with appointment times in his calendar. He sat down at the end of my bed without saying a word, and I felt emboldened and terrified in the same breath. He told me not to be afraid. He told me he'd watched me for a while. He said he knew about my husband. He knew the length of my showers. He could have been making all of this up. The part of me trained to categorize likely causes of illusions cataloged him under sleep deprivation and sympathetic nervous system overdrive. That part was rational and clinical. Another part, an exhausted, softer part, wanted company. We talked for hours. He asked me about simple things, what I'd wanted to be as a kid, what my husband sounded like when he snored, what I loved most about taking sunrise walks with him. He listened to my answers like someone taking notes. I suppose it was the sort of listening that's rare. In the morgue, I'm used to being the listener, the cataloger. That night, he turned the mirror around. He asked me things I had not given to anyone. Do you dream of his face? Do you ever feel him? I told him the truth. Yes. The truth is that grief had become geography to me. I could name his smell in the dark, but I could not map where it came from anymore. And after talking, for the first time in many months, I slept. Not the fitful lying awake counting each breath sleep. Genuine, soft, morning light sleep. I woke up with the sunlight in my eyes and a small quietness inside me I had not felt in a long time. The little man was gone. There was no note, nothing to prove the night had been more than a dream except for the steady absence that had grown smaller. From then on, he came often. Not every night, but enough that I began to schedule my loneliness around him. We spoke about the streets I walked, the bodies I carried, the men whose fingers were stiff when we closed their hands. He never judged. He had a way of asking questions that made me feel like I mattered, like the messy stitches in my life were an interesting tapestry rather than a ruin. The envelope changed everything. On the third week, I woke up, and there it was, small, white, a pale rectangle, on my bedside table. It looked like a reward or an accusation. There was no writing on it. I held it and felt ridiculous, like a child with contraband. My fingers trembled. I thought maybe I'd brought it home with me from work, misplaced paperwork. I flipped it open with the lazy care of someone who's been holding too many fragile things and expecting them to break. Inside was a folded slip, thinner than tracing paper, with a single sentence. "We've been waiting." I told myself there must be a reasonable explanation. We handle death records. Sometimes families give us notes for the files. I checked our logs. No note, no record. At work, I mentioned nothing. You don't mention the small, strange things because mentioning invites skepticism and mockery and, worse, attention. Then I started noticing envelopes in other places, at scenes, in the way only a person who has become blind to horror could miss them before. In a stoop where an old woman had frozen in the night, an envelope was tucked under a cinder block. In a studio apartment where a young kid who'd been dealing drugs had not climbed down from his own decisions, an envelope lay on the kitchen counter, lying open like an invitation. The coroner's assistant found one at a house fire. A city sanitation worker found one by the river. Every time, small and white and blank, always the single sentence folded inside. "We've been waiting." It's hard to explain how an object transforms from curiosity into dread. At first, I told myself we were being pranked. The city has a dozen strange gangs that make art installations for reasons I don't understand. Then, slow, insidious, the thought nodded. What if the envelopes were not meant for us to find? What if they were the last ordinary thing these rooms had hosted before they became sites of endings? I carried the envelope to work like an illicit truth. I showed it to no one. The little man's visits increased after that. He would come in the dusk with his damp hat and sit in my doorway, and without ceremony, wait. He said little about the envelopes except once, in a voice that was both patient and bored. "They are invitations." When I asked invitations to what, he cocked his head and smiled, the way you smile when someone has asked you to notice an obvious thing. "To stop being alone," he said. I began to look at the deaths differently. Before, each removal was an isolated incident. Paperwork filed, bodies moved, lives catalogued under cause and date. After the envelopes and the little man, pattern-seeking crept into me. I started to notice the quiet details people had skipped. The way the TV was always on at the last show, the kettle cooling, the glasses placed side by side like they expected to. Each envelope was always lying near the bedside, sometimes tucked under a pillow, sometimes on the dresser, always in the place where a person would be last seen alive. I started to feel like an archaeologist of endings, scraping dust off a story and finding the same chapter marked in every book. At work, I dug through old case files on quiet afternoons. I found pictures I had not taken, the composition of a room, the angle of an arm, the small objects left on a table. In half a dozen files dating back a couple of years, I found, hidden in photographs, never mentioned in reports, the faint presence of an envelope. It had been there all along, a pale ghost in the background no one had bothered to tag, because who would tag an envelope? It took me 2 whole weeks of obsessive looking to connect them in my head. When the pattern finally made sense, my breath packed into my chest like a fist. The little man, when I finally asked him what it meant, did not seem surprised I'd discovered it. "Patterns are comforting," he said. "They make endings polite." He shrugged. "We give people chances to say yes. Say yes." The phrase was a puppet string inside my chest. The idea that a dead person had been given a chance, an invitation. The thought made my palms sweat. I tried to be scientific about fear. I tried to mentally sort the events into natural causes. But after months of seeing envelopes, white, folded always with that one sentence, rationality began to fray. One night, after a stretch of sleepless shifts, where the city had given me body bag after body bag after body bag like dominoes, I came home and found the envelope again. This time it was different. It was not on the table. It was in my hand when I woke up from a foggy, dreamlike sleep. I had no memory of it entering my room. My fingers traced the edge like someone feeling for a pulse. Inside the slip there was the same sentence, but the paper felt warmer than paper should. It read, "We will keep you company if you wish." I set the envelope on my chest and laughed then, a small, brittle sound that surprised me. For a year I'd been living in a hollow that no light got into. I had been taking bodies, cataloging life's endings, and going to bed alone. The little man had given me nights where I could breathe. He had listened without pity. He had said words that made the raw ache in my ribs undulate into something like relief. So when the envelope sat on my chest like an offered hand, a part of me, capable of terrible practical decisions, thought, maybe this is how you close a wound. Maybe this is how you stop being the person who keeps finding endings, but never allows herself to be part of the living again. That thought is the dangerous thing. It makes sense. It sounds reasonable. And in the small hours when your mind is porous and grief is a currency, reasonable sounds like salvation. So I stood in the doorway and watched him. He was, as always, small and patient. He tilted his head and held out his hands, not in menace, not in pleading. In them, unexpectedly, there was another envelope. I felt my throat go tight. I thought of my husband and the way his laugh used to catch on the wrong syllable, the smell of his jacket. I thought of the bodies I moved, the softness in their necks, the way their hands relaxed. I imagined, absurdly, someone wrapping my life carefully and walking me to a place where I would not wake with nightmares. When he said, "You could stop being the handler," it was not a question. It was a proposal. The living choice language of stop made it sound tidy. Stop work, stop grief, stop nights of empty mugs. He promised quietly that it would be like stepping out of a storm into a warm house. I don't tell you this to make me heroic or foolish. I tell you because I want you to feel how reasonable the offer sounded to someone exhausted. Offers become sharp in the dark and easy to grab. I took the envelope. I will not lie. My hand shook. I unfolded the paper. The sentence inside now read, "We have room for one more." I sat down on the bed and read it 3 times. I thought of calling someone. Anyone. My phone lay across the room, a small rectangle that could have wrung neighbors awake and brought in light. But my voice, when I tried it, was a sandpaper whisper. I could not make it across the room. The man watched with a kindness that felt like strategy. You don't have to decide now, he said. Decisions are for people with options. You can sleep on it. He stood and walked toward the doorway. Then he turned back once, and for a blink of a moment his face looked almost like my husband's, older, patient, tired. Come by when you know, he said, then he was gone. I think the worst part of regret is how ordinary it feels before it becomes a wall. For a week I argued with myself. I refused to go to the envelope. I told myself I would bring it to work and show my supervisor, and we'd laugh and then file an incident report, and the city would send out a van with lights and men in vests, and everything would be normal again. But the little man's presence grew like mold, quiet, spreading. My sleep returned. My mornings stopped being a set of small victories. I began to accept that the invitation was less about leaving a life and more about being invited into a uniform stillness. On the night I finally made my choice, the city was raining. Rain has a sound that makes complicated things look simple. I stood at the sink and stared at my reflection in the window and told myself a dozen reasons to live. I wrote a note for the coroner's office. If I did this, I thought someone should know it was not an accident. I boiled water for tea and poured it down the sink, petty symbolic acts meant to anchor me. Then I undid the envelope inside my hand like I was peeling a bandage. The sentence read, "We will be gentle." I remember thinking how like an ambulance that sounded. I remember thinking that the very idea of being held and quieted after a year of being the one who handled endings felt like a mercy. You should know what happens next, because you are probably imagining it, and your imagination is cruel. I signed. In a way, a signature was not needed, but my brain needed closure. I put the slip in my pocket. I lay down. The little man came, as he always did, and sat on the bed. He looked smaller than before, like someone who had consumed less air by the day. He smiled at me as though he was proud I had mustered the courage to admit the truth about myself. I woke up the next morning with the envelope on my bedside table. That sentence was gone. In the corner of the room, like an echo, lay the soup bowl I'd left untouched. The city hummed outside. The dog next door barked. I felt lighter. For one thin, exquisite minute, I felt like I had untied a knot and let it drop. And then the realization struck like a dropped pan. Every one of the rooms we had removed bodies from. Every one of those people who had once sat on chairs and watched television and boiled water had the same paper somewhere in their room. I had been the one to carry them. I had been the one to wheel them away. The lightness was not relief. It was the shallow calm of something slipping into a place you cannot return from. I had not been given a choice. I had been taught to choose. The envelopes were not invitations to be kind. They were confirmations that the cue moved. That is the lingering fear you want me to leave you with. Choices have consequences, and sometimes the consequence is that you are nearer to the thing you thought you'd only ever touch from the outside. I had become the kind of person who ensured endings were tidy. In the silence after the choice, I realized I had stepped from one role into another, and whatever kind of comfort I had tasted was the kind that came from being put on a shelf. I won't tell you everything. I owe myself that much. What I will say is this. There are things in the city that make offers dressed like kindness. There are small men who sit on the edge of your bed and listen, and paper slips that read like promises. Maybe they are mercy. Maybe they're something else. All I know is the envelope kept appearing everywhere I'd stood as a witness. If you ever find a small white envelope where you would put your last glass of water, Don't smile and fold it into your pocket like a lover's note. Don't accept company just because you miss conversation. Please, call someone. Open all your doors, keep the light on, and leave it on. Have you ever had one of those nights where an offer sounded like salvation and turned out to be a closing? Let me know in the comments. I'm still listening.